these particular events. And we are very grateful for this issue because this project has been discussed for many with different scholars and different time regarding what is current situation of critical heritage studies, what all of you here doing in this conference. There are some fundamental questions that are embedded in this roundtable design, which is what is actually being critical. And often when we're looking at contemporary issues, politics for instance, it's great. However, it's also shadows there are some limitations. The other question is, what is heritage? I know that all of us scholars working on the conception of heritage, a different approach. But some of us will think about that actually there's a way to move beyond contemporary studies. It's useful to looking at contemporary because it's rupture, and some of our methodology look at events. However, if we look at some kind of longitudinal procedure, we will see something transcendental, something beyond time and space. And also, even we are interdisciplinary, some geographer, historian, anthropologist, but we are interested in something about continuous patterns and practice in a longitudinal approach. We know in different countries or different culture, if we're looking at contemporary, it's often focused on modern nation states. Modern nation states have very short period of life cycle. But talking about heritage beyond the term heritage exists in different countries, that's making something even more interesting. How about those things about continuity and how that kind of idea or practice of heritage transform the society? And these questions shape our theme of today's roundtable. And we are very lucky and grateful for people from working in different areas geographically and also in different discipline. But we are focusing on essential questions, and these are the questions we are focusing on. I read aloud. How do you find the historical approach useful in your research on heritage studies or critical of heritage studies? Could you provide some specific examples from your study where you have used history as a research method in heritage? And how does the approach facilitate exchange between Western, non-Western, and sometimes tangible and intangible culture and nature, those kind of created binary notions and practice of heritage, particularly those related to local and indigenous perspective? So we are in a roundtable setting, and each of us have different kind of case studies, ideas, and research, and we will have reflection based on our previous year's research, not particular on one particular project, and focusing these themes will help us have some insight, reflection, and discussion for all the floors and audience. One of our speaker, Lucy, who is coming a bit late. That's why we are very grateful she sent us a recording for this purpose. As I said, if anyone who is interested in her approach, she's arriving tonight and she will be in the conference tomorrow, so you can still have discussing with her. So I will start, the order will start with her as a recording, and then we'll come to our other speakers. And thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I'm Lucy, and I'd like first to apologize for
You're not talking. Everybody's looking at me.
And the structure we will have is we will have some individual perceptions, and later we will slow the question to the audience.
Hello everyone, I'm Lucy, and I'd like first to apologize for not being with you today.
It was there. Sorry. Let me just close and then reopen. And maybe just this one too, close. Yeah. Yes, coming. Yes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lucy, and I'd like first to apologize for not being with you today. Uji, Professor Ju, asked me to record a short video to tell you about my work on the history of heritage, so here goes. I began working on the history of heritage in the context in the 1990s of what came to be called from France patrimonialization studies, études de la patrimonialisation. What interested me first was a perspective on processes. I considered, and I still consider, heritage as a dated project with its own history. Not the history that we attribute to heritage objects, that is, the narrative that we invest in these heritage objects, but the history of what made them heritage. I've been interested in the fossils of what I've called heritage memory. By this, I mean the ability of objects, tangible or intangible, the ability of objects through their selection, their preservation, their valorization, the ability of objects to reveal us the vision of the world that they have mobilized. It is quite an extraordinary thing, this heritage, for which laws, property regimes, and institutions have been created, and which has, in many countries, which has even become an institution in its own right. Why and how, that is the question, and what to do today with the fruits of all these investments by past generations, how to understand them, how to explain them, these were my first questions. In doing so, of course, I couldn't fail to notice the infinite particularity of heritage. The heritage created in 1950 in Quebec does not obey the same worldviews as the heritage created at the same time in the US, for example. The word patrimoine itself covers its own semantic universe and doesn't call on the same legal systems or the same knowledge as the word heritage, for example. To date, what I say about patrimoine in French is not on the same register or about the same things as what I say when I talk about heritage. It is a problem that remains open to this day. Because heritage is also a discourse with its own languages, I proposed this time for a critical perspective rather than a historical perspective. I propose that heritage is at least as much information as it is property, and that is precisely on the basis of this faculty that we can reconstruct our ways of making heritage today, this time to reflect our state of society and not to deprive ourselves of this fabulous tool for the production of meaning. It is in the discursive nature of heritage that we find the possibility for all to participate in heritage and to participate in it on the same level, since we agree that no word is more valuable than another, especially if it expresses a person's experience. As long as they are information, all heritages belong to whoever claims them and are all equal. From this point of view, it is possible to turn to the spoken word about heritage into an instrument for enhancing the value of the person bearing that word, for example, in oral history enhancement operations that consider the narratives of all parties on an equal footing. Today, this is one of the avenues I'm exploring, this inclusive history of heritage as a history of experiences of heritage, which could perhaps enable us to move beyond the processes of exclusion that have marked our society and which heritage has helped considerably. My work on the history of heritage now leads me to gather and value the word of those involved in heritage, of all those involved in heritage, those who have made a profession of talking about it, and those who did not dare talk about it until now. So my history of heritage is a history of processes and a history of experiences. Do not hesitate to write to me. I would be delighted to discuss this with you. Have a great roundtable.
Thank you, Lucy. As said, she will be around tomorrow, so happy to discuss with her if you have any reflection or feedback or question. No.
Thank you very much. You seem very practiced there. I'm not going So yeah, thank you very much, Eugene, for asking me to come along to this this roundtable. And as Eugene said, there's three questions, and the first was, I thought, how do you find the historical approach? Oh, you can see them there. How do you find the historical approach useful in your research on heritage studies? I addressed these quite literally when I was sitting down a few weeks ago thinking about this. And at first sight, when I saw this first question, this might be revealing actually, I just saw the question as being most relevant the other way round actually. So in other words, how do you find heritage studies most useful in your research on, in my case, historical geography? Because it's sort of maybe a bit revealing here, but I don't come from a background in something called heritage studies. I've got no qualifications in heritage studies. I came to these ideas very much through historical geography, and I found that what has become seen as a processual view of heritage is useful in understanding practices and processes that I was seeing as an historical geographer. Specifically, my PhD back in the early 90s, where I found it useful to understand how certain elements of medieval parishes and territorial court districts worked in West Cornwall, weaving the weaving of deeply situated, almost sort of folkloric myths and worldviews with official demands and practices of governance, people weaving narratives to suit their particular viewpoints, even reenacting supposed historical events, such as saints. There's an Irish connection. Saints coming across from Ireland to Cornwall on oak leaves or sailing on millstones, which is not something I'd recommend. But it's sort of imaginary or real. This is a means to connect notions of pastness to present circumstances and hope for future scenarios. So in that sense, the question of how an historical approach is useful for my understanding of heritage doesn't make sense when I first looked at it. So in some ways, I guess I've always seen the connection as totally inherent. Not that real events must have happened, but that real or imagined ideas of past matter. I guess in other ways I have an admission in that I've not really done heritage studies or in a formal sense, at least not until around 2015 when I began to write a series of papers which had heritage and in the title, heritage and landscape and scale and climate change and text or commemoration and so on. And I think this is why I found writing one of the first times of that heritage and I found writing the chapter on history of heritage so difficult but also really quite appealing. I ended up writing about how the process through which notions of pastness, real or imagined, or resources of heritage, if you like, whether the H word is invoked or not, have been used, formally deployed or otherwise invoked. I think is essential as something to humanity, as a story or a life. There is a life history of this process, and this can be told. So, in other words, heritage as a process has a biography that can be placed in a sequence, not necessarily linear, and the analysis of this can tell us something about issues of power and politics, identity and human relations, and over a period of time, and always connected to an ongoing or unfolding sense of future making. And I guess this brings me to the second question, a couple of examples, and I think two which illustrate this in slightly different elements of this is firstly, written a couple of papers in the last few years about tar steps in Exmoor, southwest England. This is an ancient bridge. It's England's oldest bridge, and it keeps on getting washed away. It's been washed away about at least 13 times since the 1950s. So it keeps getting washed away and then rebuilt. So it's England's oldest bridge, but it's also its newest bridge. And the act of rebuilding it is used as an occasion to celebrate its ancientness, so that the secondary origins of rebuilding seem to come before the primary origins of it supposedly being a very old bridge, and nobody can really agree how old it really is anyway. And I see, well, it was only built last year, that's how old it is. You can use this to examine issues of value in different registers like national identity or technological achievement or relations of nature and culture or Anthropocene, or examine ideas of authenticity, or confound standard notions of the palimpsest, which are central to disciplines like historical geography and archaeology. And another example, which I'll talk a bit about just very quickly, is I've been writing a little bit about recently, is a great big storm that took place on Dartmoor in 1638. The storm really did happen, a lightning storm, Several people got killed in October the 20th, I think off the top of my head, in 1638. It was written about in pamphlets which were published in London in just a couple of weeks, where they brought up eyewitnesses. Then it was various poems were written, antiquarian tracts over, and you can see how the story changes slightly over the following centuries. The event early on is connected to God's divine judgment on sinners. Then it's evidence of God's powers of protection. Then it gets used as a means of instruction for how we should live. But by the 19th century, there's a shift. The same event is now all blamed on the devil. And this is the story gains traction and becomes enrolled in a nascent tourism industry as a sort of nice romantic legend. And then becomes used as a means through which to explain some interesting archaeological features that again were starting to be uncovered and talked about in the 19th century. An entire landscape is explained through heritage as a malleable resource, even though it's roughly based upon some real events that took place in 1638. So you can trace changing power relations, attitudes to science, to religion, to God, how people actively connect past, presents and futures through heritage processes. And so from this we learn that we need to move beyond singular representations of the past and conventional understandings of heritage as being about preservation and stabilization of a certain valued artifacts. And I think this brings me to the third question here. How does this approach facilitate exchange between Western and non-Western knowledge, notions and practices of heritage, particularly related to local and indigenous perspectives? I guess talking about my own story again, being an historical geographer working in the southwest of England, and there is a lot, this is my story here as well, in a sense that I had a lot of care responsibilities from my mum and then later on my dad, and then from the mid-90s to my dad died 2011, so I had about 15, 20 years. I wasn't going very far. Everything ends up being, all of my examples are generally in Devon and Cornwall, and that's in almost all of my work before about 2015 is based on the southwest of England, and so it's like not just Eurocentric but ultra Eurocentric. It's like Devon is Cornwall centric. I just didn't go anywhere, but I guess I did have the confidence, particularly as a PhD student, and there just shortly afterwards to just go for it a bit. And I guess it's ironic, therefore, that once I actually started to read on work based on other parts of the world and written by people who've come from different scholarly traditions, different linguistic backgrounds, intellectual traditions, and the more and more I found that what I thought were my ideas when I was first writing as a sort of slightly arrogant student and so on, then maybe maybe the role I played a role in critiquing what now gets talked about as authorized heritage discourses, but I think people have been doing this for a very long time and usually without much recognition. And so if there is one thing that I reckon we most need now is to try and further break down national assumptions, realize the power relations between global north and south and the connections and those connections, flows, barriers that exist both within internationally recognized heritage practice, UNESCO and so on, but also within academic discussions, because it strikes me that while heritage has been co-opted by certain international institutions and others, then something called critical heritage can also be quite narrow in its framing and inevitably connected to elite institutions and privileged scholars, often from the global north and anglophone world. So yeah, that's what I was going to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, David. David has been very humble, but we know a lot of us actually know that one of his texts, as he mentioned, is one of the fundamental texts that are being very influential in the historical approach and process as a plural. Thank you. Now we're very lucky to have back here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Part of what I am working on is also very biographical, and even my academic journey took me through different directions back to where I am today. I started my undergraduate degree, philosophy, so my bachelor's degree is in philosophy, and then just seemed not to do it for me, and then my master's degree is in religion and culture, and after that I went for a PhD in history because it seemed to me that history will help me find answers to a lot of questions that I constantly had. Even within history, I studied and worked on a very small part of history or discipline within history, which is development development history, right? Looking at development interventions, long-term impacts of development interventions, how they shape the lives of the people, or how the people shape the lives of those projects. And here I'm talking about things like big dams, right, which we see in places like Africa and also in Asia. In the course of doing that work and that research, more and more I was drawn back to the question of culture and heritage. And what really fascinated me or was of great interest to me is the question of the displacement of gods, right? So when you have these big projects, usually they tend to happen within indigenous communities, these local communities. They bring these big projects there. They always involve some form of migration or displacement or resettlement. And when these people are resettled, what is not resettled are their gods, right? Most times their gods get submerged in water when we are dealing with dam projects. And then the question for me is, how does this affect them, right? Given that some of these communities, their whole lives are also usually wrapped around their religious belief systems. And now you came in there, you build this big dam, you resettle them, their gods, their ancestors, all of that, all of those remain behind. So that for me was one of the starting points where I started looking again more closely to questions of heritage, and also coming from the context of Africa, where we have to deal with a lot of colonialism as well, and colonialism here not just in terms of the political impositions, but I'm also thinking talking about what Althusser might call ideological state apparatuses, so the education sector, for example, the religious sector as well, right? How these have shaped us, and we have a new heritage, or we have new cultures and new heritage as a result of this. As I'm speaking to you, we have an issue right now in my state capital in Nigeria. We have these monuments. I believe they are on the tentative list. It's called the Nkarasi monoliths. Sometimes they are misinterpreted as rock arts, but they're actually not rock arts. About 19 or 20 years ago, we had a governor of the state who really wanted to promote tourism, and he did monuments in the city with some of these monoliths, right? Now you have a new governor whose wife is a Christian pastor. She came in and she's removing them and putting the statue of Jesus, right, in the city. Why do I say this? It's just to show you how sometimes these become very complex and contested. There are people who are arguing that Christianity is our heritage, right? That is what we should celebrate in the city center. But you have a previous governor who thought that this is an important aspect of our heritage, but this was also connected to tourism, right? So the commodification of heritage, which can also be problematic, right? So that we have these, so what really, it raises this question, what really is our heritage? What is my heritage? This is a question that I'm struggling with. I am trying to even find answers for myself as someone who lives in this colonized body, right? I always joke that my parents are more Catholic than the Pope, right? Growing up within this kind of environment, right? Where the heritage, what is their heritage, is this Christian heritage. And then trying to find out that no, somewhere along the line there's a disruption, and I can feel and sense that disruption within me, because I begin to see that Christianity itself, which I'm raised in, cannot answer all the questions I have, cannot bring me that fulfillment. I always feel like there's something missing in my own life. and then trying to find what is missing. And there the tools of history become very important to me. Most of the work that I do is around interpretation and presentation of heritage. It is really interesting how certain things that even within our African cultural context today, they think these things are part of our African heritage, but they are not. Some of those things are things that came after the advent of the Europeans. But because they've been with us for a while, people begin to think that actually these are our African traditions. But history helps us to look and say, no, this wasn't a part of our tradition. This wasn't a part of our heritage. This is something that was imposed from outside. It's not part of who we are. But there is a place for heritage for us, most especially those of us who live in these colonial bodies. I say I live in this colonial body because I'm sitting here speaking to you in English language, not very fluent even in my own native language, right? So I carry that colonial identity every day with me, as much and as hard as I try to ward it off, but I carry it with me. I carry that colonial body with me. I carry that colonial heritage with me wherever I go. But heritage can be a powerful tool for us to reassert our identity and also to reclaim our history and also the narratives, right? And this is where I think is one of the challenges that we face. And this is where most times I just get so exhausted trying to fight this. Sometimes it feels like you are really lonely, right, in this fight. Because people will look at you when you begin to talk about certain things. They think you are demonic. They think it's voodoo. They think it's evil. But I'm like, this is our ancestors, our great ancestors. This is who they were, right? I was saying to someone 3 days ago that to even imagine, or someone to say that because my grandfather, not even my great-grand, my parents were first-generation Christians, that my grandfather is somewhere burning in hell because he did not accept this foreign religion. Or for anyone to think that, Christianity, for example, is the only way, because that's what was taught to my parents and millions of other people, that this is the way, right? For anyone to think, I see some form of arrogance in that you're condemning billions of people, right, to hell. So there is a place for us, right? There's a place for heritage for us who are living in these colonial bodies to reassert our identities, to be able to reclaim our own histories, our histories that have been disrupted, the narratives that have been changed by colonialism. There is a place for us, and heritage is an important tool. Is an important tool for us. The last thing I want to also quickly mention is the way the West looks at, sometimes they look at our heritage, even when we have dossiers that are going UNESCO World Heritage, going up for UNESCO World Heritage inscription. The way sometimes we look at, it's like we are attempting to freeze things in one place forever. You can't change it. This has to always be this way. It has to be this way. And we undermine that circle of life, right? Which sometimes within our African cultures, we have this ontological reality. We have this situation where there's this deep connection between the living and the dead. Just because a particular thing no longer exists physically, you can't touch it, doesn't mean it's dead, right? It's going through a cycle. And this is something else that, that is worth noting and knowing, even when we have these kinds of conversations in gatherings like this. Thank you.
Hey, Becky. Thank you very much, Becky. And now we'll move from Nigeria and Canada to and also from very super West-centric regions, somewhere some people was born, to China, where I am. So I'm an anthropologist by training, and my early work and most of my work, still now ongoing work, is mainly focused on heritage and memory politics in contemporary China. The limitation of contemporary China make me feel all my research data is focusing on China as a modern nation state, which is just recent 100 years. And that's also shaped that whole idea of practice of heritage and definition of heritage, vocabulary of heritage. Most of them are Western product, starting from early 20th century, by war and later missionaries and later also import of Western discipline through Japan into China. I do find the limitation of the work because even the vocabulary or ideas of heritage didn't exist. Beyond that, there's still a lot of things we need to learn about, just like Becky was talking about. What does ideas, like you talk about religion, or material culture, like bridge, does it mean before heritage is? That's why I came to my new project, which like using heritage as a lens to study Chinese heritage beyond Western conception of heritage. So this is a framework. Often we're looking at only very last period of China, which is a modern nation state. But if we think about something go beyond that, we can make it even broaden the context, right? It's a longitude approach can help us to understand the conception beyond the English term heritage in Chinese context. The idea of transformation practice, for instance, how private collection has transformed into modern museums and later on recently become digitalization projects. Transformation of material culture, right? There's a lot of material culture go beyond China as a modern nation state. Transformation of ideas. There's a lot of religion, or so-called religion, but actually religion, this whole concept is a Western concept after missionary get in. There was Confucian's ideas, maybe Taoism, Buddhism was another import, but this kind of mixture and exchange creates a new form of heritage practice. So that kind of transformation, I'm looking at how private and elite heritage and transformed, democratized into modern idea of public and inclusiveness. So what I'm interested in this new project, which I show in the book, is looking at the idea of change and continuity. So what has been changed and what has been continued during the regime shift. I'm using an example in the book to just illustrate what I mean. Last year when I was doing my fieldwork very happily after the COVID, I was in one local heritage site and doing my fieldwork, and that's a place beautiful in the summer. A group of students, high school students, just finished the exam. They're doing their summer vacation and doing a game in a local heritage site. The game is they're sitting on a beautiful stream, and there was flowing cups. When the cups came to a student, the person need to get the cups. Either you recite a poem, a Chinese calligraphic poem, ancient poem. If you fail to do it, you need to drink the water. Supposed to be alcohol, but because they're under 18, it's water. Most of us will think about this is consumption culture. There's maybe there's an HD behind it because it's an authorized feeling effect. If Laura Jens is here talking about a sense of beauty, sense of aesthetics, shaped idea of heritage. But if we go beyond that and looking at transcendental into long durée approach, this gathering actually occurred 1700 years ago. It was in 353 CE, where a group of elites organized a party in a living stream. It's a political game because those are people, social elites, was not very happy with the constant social crisis, political governance, so they moved their attention to the nature, where they gathered, they drink alcohol, they're getting drunk, happily in a party, reciting poem, and lots of these things has become a very important calligraphy and legacies into the next generations. That event has become a very fundamental event in Chinese calligraphy culture, because I found if we look at a longue durée approach, that event has shaped into 3 different forms of reproduction: the calligraphy art, the site, and the gathering itself has been keeping reproduced and remake as different form of heritage in different time framework. First, if we're looking at a longue durée approach, there's a history of reproducing the calligraphy itself. Some of you may practice calligraphy. If you practice calligraphy, each time it's in a different shape. So that particular calligraphy has been reproduced, imitated, rubbed by different people in different generations, have been created in later generations, and even now, people still keep practicing that, imitating that calligraphy as a sage in ancient Chinese culture. The second is the history of sight, because people are very happily enjoy that gathering and the game. So later generations, not only the modern people, but also in different generations, people show a worship to that kind of gathering. In different time period, people start to gather. To fulfill that gathering practice, people also make the gathering wide in stream, play the game, and create different material sites to worship and imitate that kind of stage of gathering. So lots of material culture has been produced. It's not only mainly in China. I found interesting that since 500 years before, that kind of culture has been also influenced in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and many other countries in East Asia, and which they're not only worshiping to China, but also creating their own kind of heritage legacies in different areas. So it's being a global diplomacy going on. I also find it's also a history of personal experience and emotion during that kind of longue durée approach. In each time period, a lot of people would like to go to that area as a pilgrimage, to worship that place. Even people do not know the exact location because vaguely indicated in the sites as a text. Text is always very hard to describe, right? As we know, history. But people want to see the actual site. Authenticity matters. The materials matters. Even people are not satisfied with the local actual location, they really have a sense of, oh, that's the place. So each generation, people keep searching and find a place. Even in modern education project like I just described, now young students also trying to worship that sage. There's emotion and effect, but it's not only contemporary, but also happen in the history. There's also a history of diplomacy. If we look not only contemporary, but also in a longue durée, things that happen of that kind of calligraphy culture has been shaped in different areas in East Asia. There are a lot of exchange between Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan. Many scholars or literates, they are trying to work together, gathering, exchange, festivals, even during the time when there was international conflicts during the geopolitics. But calligraphy art and gathering become very interesting soft power for diplomacy, not now, but happening also in the past. Last but not least, I found also a history of consumption culture. In each generation, people try to gather, imitate that kind of gathering culture, keep drinking, keep writing calligraphy, producing a lot of material culture. But the difference compared to modern society is, in the early days, it's mainly focused on social elites who have the time, who have the power, who have the resource to enjoy the nature and enjoy the calligraphy and enjoy time. But these days, it's become public. Anyone, anywhere, anytime, and any format that people can enjoy and pay pilgrimage to that gathering. So what's the implication of this story? There's one idea of authenticity and creativity. Often authenticity as a Western concept often focuses on material culture. But here we can see that even there's a long history of reproduction, the creativity has been involved into the meaning-making procedure. The second is the idea of tangible, intangible. And often there's a stereotype between the Western focus on material, tangible, while the so-called East Asia is focused on spirituality. However, in this example, we can see that both tangible and intangible matters. It's the both tangible and intangible intertwined, works together to make that history of reproduction happens. The last one, we can see that it's not really only about legacies or transformation or transmission, but also through reproduction and exchange that can make transmission happens. My long-duration approach from this project, what I see is from two things. First is what has been changed and what has been continued. We can see there's a shift from social elites or private into very democratic public, even in an authoritarian state. But we can also see shifting technology and platforms. Early days, in a nature side, there were any artificial bridge. But these days, there are landscape, built environment, material culture, consumption culture, but also digital platforms. Within all of these shifting technologies, everyone, everywhere, you can access to heritage. But what is continued during that long-term approach? I found heritage, even we don't call it heritage in the early days, but heritage has been continuous as a social and political action. In that calligraphy story, the social elites in the beginning were trying to using heritage to move from the political crisis to the nature. That these days, heritage still keep continuously as a very important form to shape cultural identity, legitimize political authority, and facilitating knowledge transmission and social transformation. And thank you very much. And that's my approach. Maybe there are some questions from the panels.
I was going to say, I'd like to ask Lucy, but I'd actually draw from Lucy and think about as the issue about language. And I've written down and circled it a few times, translation, and translation, both in a literal sense of sort of the Anglophone world and which tends to dominate things, and the possibilities of translation, interpretation between different languages, but also, I guess, negotiation, interpretation, translation. There's a sort of lots of things, lots of, like heritage provides a possibility, or whether it's sort of the stuff I was doing about negotiation of folk myths of Celtic saints in the 600s with authorities and so on, and just sort of there's a sort of heritage as a lens through which stuff is possible, and that can be sort of not, you could say hegemonic and so on, but you could also say there's a possibility of resistance, with a possibility of an alternative future can be cast in that, and I sort of get some of these questions, get some of these possibilities from listening to you two as well, and Lucy.
Maybe Beck has some ideas in terms of language in Nigeria case.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I also had, the word negotiated, contested. These were some of the words that I also have here. And I mean, as I was saying earlier, things are not frozen in time. There's encounters, right? So you're going to have new encounters. You're going to have new ideas and influences, and how do we stay true to the heritage when we encounter these new ideas and evolve in a responsible way? So because negotiations are not always equal negotiations, it depends on which kinds of ideas that you encounter, right? So that we remain true to the heritage of the people. And what it evolves to, I guess where I'm trying to go with this is, in this evolutionary process, can we think of being true to that particular heritage, or a new form of heritage overpowers or overcome the heritage of that community? Yeah.
Thank you. I found particular language matters, and there's also a relationship between language and ideas. For instance, in Chinese case, the time 20th century is very important. I mean, maybe also matters to some other settler colonial countries, for instance. because that's the time where there's a lot of interaction between Western and local indigenous ideas and through local practice. We also need to think about there's late 19th century, there's international heritage laws going around. There's also universities. Lots of people from, for instance, in China, they went to US, went to Europe, went to Japan to learn how museum was important and as a form of display, empire on display. And they learned that kind of techniques and going back. This, what in meantime, the missionaries, right, and they went to China and went many other countries, they start to influence the ideas. Of course, there's a lot of negotiation and conflicts, but what I find interesting is that often, yes, there's some negotiations, but lots of structure of ideas still being remained into Chinese context. For instance, the idea of library, the idea of museums, the idea of university, the idea of archaeology, the idea of anthropology. All of these things has become very fundamental in contemporary. If we do not really go back to that kind of transition period, we are in the time of the production of heritage rather than we see where we come from. So it's very important to go that period.
Yeah, I mean, even talking about museum, as you mentioned museums, I was thinking about in the context in some communities in Africa, even as we deal with this issue of Benin bronzes or some of these artifacts outside of sacred objects outside of Africa. The idea of a museum is not something that registers so much, right, traditionally among the people. Yet the emphasis always is you need to build these new museums that have temperature control, that have all of this, so that we put these things, right, these objects back there. And the question I always ask is, these objects in the first place, they came from the tropics, and they did not come from museums. Now you want to imprison them in museum, or we can't give them back to you because you wouldn't know how to preserve them because you don't have a fancy museum. Yet people don't actually go to museums. People, unless school children are carried into a museum, you know, to show them things, people don't wake up in the morning and say, let's say Nigeria, oh, I want to go to a museum today. You know, it's not something that people do. But again, this becomes some of those Western concepts of things that we embrace. They become very much a part of us. Most countries have national museums and different things, and then nobody really visits them.
I think you mentioned a very important point that not only we're not going to museum, I think we were discussing on other panels that even the current ideas of policy regarding, for instance, reconciliation, repatriation, all of these are also a modern concept. A Cold War period of production. Again, there's a historical context. Why they've been created? Without that kind of historical context, we have limited idea. Even we're trying to be critical, but without that kind of context, historical context, we're very limited in that kind of feeling good, guilt practice. Especially in settler colonial countries. Right.
So it's not just a case of who's asking the questions and what questions are possible, but it's more who gets to define the field of what questions might even be around. It's much deeper than that.
We have some time. First, it's kind of notification since we're turning a bit late, starting a bit late. So would you mind if we end a bit late? 5 to 10 minutes-ish? 5, 10 minutes? Okay, now probably we open the floors, see if there are any questions.
Everyone wants
Please.
to go home.
Thank you.
Discussion. I think there's many things that I could kind of pick up on, but maybe I guess I kind of follow David's line of thinking that an interesting kind of historical approach to heritage is kind of figuring out when specific meanings were added to some heritages or when something became heritage. And I think the kind of the story of the storm was quite good example of that, how it actually changes through time, what are the meanings associated with it, what is the kind of societal message in it, what is kind of the governance of people also that is tried to do through that. So I'm really kind of interested in kind of identifying those changes, and perhaps more on the discontinuities than the continuities, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Which kind of meanders back to my question, which might be a little bit abstract, but I work very much in contemporary culture now, but I'm a historian by my earliest training. And I remember my history professor always saying that even though the study of history is a lot about narratives and continuities, but it's fundamentally a study of change. So history is always about the change, things that change, and understanding how those changes take place, and kind of understanding the different issues related to that. But I think it was Becke, you who mentioned that heritage in a way has a very different desire of trying to keep things the same and kind of prevent change. We're critical heritage studies, so maybe we don't kind of believe that, but that it's definitely something that's very much embedded in the idea of heritage. So I would kind of like to maybe kind of provoke you to think a little bit more about especially the role of discontinuities that are there, and really this kind of the conflict that is between history and heritage, actually, that the idea of continuing and the idea of change, because I think especially in our contemporary world, where we are kind of faced with massive expansion of material culture, which we cannot preserve, and even museums today are very much kind of buried in things, in material culture. So what has to also kind of change in terms of how we care for heritage, how we think about heritage, what things are the things we want to preserve, and so on. So maybe just kind of some ideas around that would be lovely to hear.
Sure. Maybe start.
Everyone suddenly looks at me. That's good. No, that's really interesting. And discontinuity. I mean, the thing that struck in my mind, just to draw an example from Devon, sorry, is Jurassic Coast World Heritage Site, and there's a outstanding universal value of physical processes of erosion, and in a sense, and I always find it interesting because it's a natural World Heritage Site. And because it goes through the IUCN, then the IUCN have to that can talk about things like physical processes, stuff like evolution, change, you know, and it can have a strong role. We must preserve the processes of physical erosion on this coast. We must preserve this coast falling down. We must not put up a wall to prevent it from breaking. We must allow it to erode, and in some ways I think it's really quite refreshing, both in the terms of it deals with the issue of just constant collection of more and more stuff, but it's probably, maybe I'll be wrong on this, but it's probably the only World Heritage Site that's definitely going to be there in 100,000 years. Well, it won't be there. It will be quite a few hundred miles over somewhere else, and probably maybe under an ocean or something. And and that's quite refreshing. And I just always find it is interesting. IUCN can do that. ICOMOS really can't cope with that, and so it's a problem with ICOMOS and the management of cultural heritage, in inverted commas, which the present regime of things, at least the present field, has a lot more trouble with that. And again, this goes back to issues about translations or languages sometimes.
Yeah, just I think I wasn't pushing for that things need to remain the same. Actually, don't agree with that, right? There's some fluidity and adaptability. There are going to be encounters. There's going to be evolution. But then that goes to the question of when you have all of these changes, can we even, again, I'm trying to raise a question here, can we speak of authenticity? this is something that we deal with even in ICOMOS, right? With World Heritage Sites, dossiers, and all of that. Authenticity is a big issue. So how do we deal with issues of authenticity? So that's something we could think about as well.
Great. Just a very quick comment about your idea of discontinuity. Actually, it's a very important fundamental concept in my book, which I'm talking about ruptures. And I found in Chinese history, there's a continuous cycle of destruction. Destruction not only material culture, but destruction of spirituality too. And there's a cycle, the pattern of destruction keeps that kind of Chinese heritage continuing. Each time when the rise of empire, they would destroy the previous empire's legacies, but continue using them, use that kind of destruction to legitimize. At the same time, the spirituality can continue because they got heaven, maintained of heaven. So there's interesting also debates between material and spirituality here. But again, I think discontinuity is very important, part of that heritage continuity, if you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I just need to add to that too, and I think I mentioned that in my, maybe I wasn't clear enough. It's okay for that wood carving to actually die and go away,
Yes.
decay, right? We shouldn't try to hold it in a particular state forever, or try to preserve everything, forever. Yeah.
Great. Question? Yes.
Word that was used quite a bit by you as a roundtable or panel was narrative. Now, the way in which narratives relate to identities can be on the big scale, like the triumphs and disasters of the various cultural groups to which people identify themselves, and that is very much looking at change. Or the narratives are on a very small scale, the mundanities of the everyday life into which heritages that are related to things like food or music occur. So this is where I think we're trying to juggle the continuities and the changes that we see as part of our heritage.
You want some?
Please do.
You want some response? I found quite interesting that, for instance, again from the Chinese history, that again language, again there's the issue of language. Elites, noble people have the power to own and interpret and write texts. The people who are struggling, working class, do not write. They are struggling with everyday life. The people who write, who has the power. So text, documentation becomes so key important for politics and power. And each generation of empire, they use text, reinterpreted text for transmission of the power. While the everyday life, in terms of group people, the more because they're continuing food, as you said, consumption culture. There's a flow of exchange without text.
I think again, I think there's a distinction there in a way Roy's pointed to in terms of the, elite special things, special events, special places, special stuff, and the idea of keeping them in perpetuity, which, I mean, perpetuity is a really long time, and that's not going to happen. But there's a totally different discussion in a way where in terms of, you talk about the everyday or the mundane, and I'd also put a shout out to extend our thinking in a sort of human but also non-human world as well, and perhaps in a very long period of time, hopefully, there might not be much space for humans on the world. Yeah. So.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I'm intrigued that nobody has mentioned modernity yet in your discussions, and especially with Uji, you're obviously dealing with this concept of rupture, and it made me think of Yanis Hamalakis' book The Nation and Its Ruins, where he really tried to challenge the degree of rupture and the idea of heritage as an essentially modern phenomenon by tracing back those relationships with material culture into the pre-modern. So, Uji in particular, how are you dealing with modernity in your longue durée?
Thank you. I think it's a long debate, but we put it in short that modernization is a process during early, let's say late 19th century to early 20th century, that period of time as I mentioned. There's a lot of import of thoughts, scholarships, the universities, creation of museums, libraries, and modernity becomes such important because it's intertwined with westernization. Even China is not a colonial country, but it's being westernized during that period. Now it's a later products because heritage come later. The whole discourse of heritage come 1970s. But that's the time when already archaeology, anthropology, many other things, museology has came much early than that period. So modernization came much early than heritage during that period. But in my book, or in what I'm interested, is not just see modernization as a process, but seeing before and after and the relationship. For instance, one example is looking at private library and modern library. Private museum, we don't call museum, again, translation issue, because that term museum doesn't exist. There's another term. The relationship between private museum and modern Western museum in China, and how things has been continued, and how things has been changed in that kind of interaction and negotiation and contestation. And that becomes fundamental for us to think about heritage, but go beyond that kind of Western notion of heritage. Thank you. But maybe other people want to address. There's a question there.
Of heritage isn't invented in 1970s. It's much more older, so you can trace it back to the time of the French Revolution. Yes, and surely you have to mind also related terms, as in German, the preservation of monuments,
Yes.
and that was invented about 1800
Yes.
with the French Revolution, the destructions and which happened at that time in France, in Central Europe, and so forth.
Yes.
And that was also the time when the modern world grew up. So it's quite clear that heritage preservation and modernization were two sides of one picture. Yes.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for clarification that I'm talking about in Chinese context, which lots of Western thoughts come much earlier. And during 1930s, 40s, there's a lot of regulation change that the heritage, in current term of heritage still doesn't exist that time. It was using cultural relics, and later maybe cultural property. Again, there's a discussion about which term it need to be used. And but that particular term, translation again, officially exists during later 1970s and even early 80s. That's a time where the Western translation and pick up that particular term, and then officially being used in the legalization. Yeah.
There's a really nice book. Chris Savitsky is is in Rome, Norwegian Institute in Rome, and he's written a really nice book fairly recently all about heritage management during the Roman period, and sort of because they've got quite lots of texts. And nobody uses the H word or even, but it's very clearly this sort of stuff is taking place. So yeah, absolutely agree that it doesn't get invented along with the Ancient Monuments Act of 18 whatever. Yeah.
And in European context, there's also historians has traced back to antiquarianism and artifacts and these kind of study that go back to Roman studies, and that kind of can trace back to the roots of monumentality or monuments. Again, we're not particularly focusing on particular practice, but there's some ideas of heritage happen much earlier than that. Any questions so far? Great. Okay. I think thank you very much for your reflection, discussion, and also thank you to Lucy. for this insightful discussion, and thank you again, David and Becca. And again, we have a very interesting team to work together, and also everyone appreciate your discussions. And I hope you enjoy the rest part of the conference.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.